Hey, what's happening, CNFers? It's your buddy Brendan here, coming at you from hashtag CNF Podcast HQ, aka the Bedroom Closet. What we've got here is a rerun. It's a throwback to 2013, episode 3, with Brian Mockenhaupt, who is the freelance journalist who wrote the award-winning byliner original The Living and the Dead. Just an excellent piece on a group that was under attack, and then the subsequent PTSD. It's a wonderful story, beautifully reported and beautifully written. Why I'm doing this rerun here is because I had broken up that episode 3 into 3 parts, because back then I tried to keep the episodes very short, like 20 to 25 minutes, and now since I typically run about hour-long episodes, I decided to just put this one all in one lump, and so you could enjoy it yet again. It'll also give you a sense of how raw the podcast was back then, and if you thought it's raw now, just wait till you hear this. It's totally, you can totally make out everything, but it's definitely a cut below what it is now, and if you think it's low now. So, in any case, if you know anybody who would like this episode, definitely share it. Share other episodes, subscribe to it on iTunes, and subscribe to the email newsletter at brendano'mara.com. Gonna go to a monthly newsletter. That's my collection plate, asking you to subscribe, share, and offer your email address if you don't mind. I don't spam ever. So in any case, enjoy this latest episode, which is a rerun sort of episode 3, and this being episode 19 with Brian Mockenhaupt. Thank you. Mockenhaupt was named the winner of the $25,000 Michael Kelly Award for his story The Living and the Dead, about a Marine platoon in Afghanistan. Brian, a former infantryman, wrote about Tom Worrell and his platoon, which suffered heavy casualties, namely Worrell's friends Jimmy Malachowski and Ian Muller, the effects of which followed Worrell home to the United States. The reporting for this piece stretched over 18 months, taking him from foot patrols in northern Marja to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where the Marines struggled to reintegrate into the world they had left behind. Brian is a contributing editor at Outside, Reader's Digest, and Esquire magazines, and is the nonfiction editor at the Journal of Military Experience. The Living and the Dead appears on byliner.com. So, Brian, how did you come to this story?
Hey, Brennan. It was a story that I wanted to write for a while. I've been covering the military, I've been writing about the wars since 2005 when I got out of the Army. And in that time, I've been back to Iraq as a journalist, and I've been to Afghanistan several times. And one of the things that always struck me was leaders in those situations are in incredibly tense and stressful moments, trying to accomplish these really hard missions while taking care of and guiding these young men under them. And when leaders get hurt or die in battle, someone has to take their place. Sometimes right in the middle of a firefight, someone has to step up and assume control. And it can be hours or weeks or months before they're able to sort of emotionally process what has happened. So someone takes over a job that they never wanted in that way. And someone says, here you go, you are now in charge of these guys, because the person right above you who might have been a friend to them, a mentor, has been killed. And then the people who are beneath them have to adjust to having a new leader at this incredibly stressful time in their lives. But finding a specific story to follow was hard for a few reasons. If you want to spend time on the ground with a unit in Afghanistan, you have to go through a logistics process, go through approval from the public affairs office and that kind of thing. So it can take a while to find out the unit you're actually going to be with on the ground. You have to say, well, I want to go to Helmand Province and be with these guys. And their tours might be, I think like for the Marines, it's, I don't know, I think they're about, their tours were a year at the time, but you have to plan ahead for getting over there and being the right people at the right time, so there's a logistics issue. But the other part of it is, I guess, sort of a tactfulness issue. It's hard to find this unit and they had suffered some casualties. You can't really just go and be like, hey, I want to come and write about your friends who are killed, one of the most terrible days of your life. It can seem a little bit ghoulish. But I was over in Afghanistan. I was going to be out with the Marines in Helmand Province, and I had gone to the little internet cafe at one of the bases there, and had read about the battalion that I was going to be with, and they had suffered a couple casualties. I didn't realize at the time that they were from the same platoon, but I figured maybe one of those guys, they're both leaders, that I might be able to tell their stories about what happens when leaders get killed in battle and how their men carry on. And when I got out to the main Marine base, from where I was going to push out to one of the smaller locations, I talked to the Marine leadership there and I explained the story to them, and they sort of got it right away. And they said, sounds like a really interesting story and one that we haven't really seen people tell before. And they put me out to the small patrol base Dakota, where Tom and his Marines are at. And Tom, as soon as I talked to him about the story and told him what I wanted to write, he was on board with it right away. And that's the only reason that the story worked, because of Tom being open enough and willing to talk about what had happened. And I think by him agreeing to that and him being so open, it kind of set the tone for the rest of the Marines. They looked at that and said, well, if our boss is good with it, then okay, I guess we're, then we trust him, and so we'll tell our stories to this guy we don't know as well.
Were you surprised that Tom was so forthcoming right off the bat?
Yeah, I was surprised because he doesn't know me, and this is something that was incredibly traumatic to these guys. I think it speaks to, probably in a lot of ways, to his devotion to Jimmy and to Ian, and that I wanted to write about who these guys were. But it was, for Tom, he was receptive to it in a way that went beyond just wanting to sort of eulogize his friends and talk about what great guys they were. From the first conversation that I had with him over there, when I explained what I wanted to write about, he pretty quickly understood where I was coming from, what I was talking about wanting to write about the extreme pressure and stress of leadership in those situations. And I think it connected with him because it was something that he was right in the middle of dealing with and feeling. You talk about just waking up or laying in bed at night and just being stressed out by the idea of having all these guys to keep safe and protect. And then after Ian and Jimmy were killed, it only got worse. But no, all credit to Tom for taking that chance to tell the story, because that kind of story doesn't work if someone's not willing to really go deep into their experiences and how they're feeling. And it's hard as a journalist. It's something I struggle with all the time, that someone is trying to find their own way through something traumatic, and their way of processing and their way of getting right with themselves and with the world enough that they can go through their days and do what they need to do. And what effect does that have when I sit down with them and say, okay, tell me about that day, and I'm going to need all kinds of details. I want to know what you were thinking about and what the sunlight looked like, how hot was it, what were the sounds like, what were the smells, and sort of how post-traumatic stress works is that all that stuff is seared in your brain, and you can, that's why years later you can smell something that takes you right back to a moment. So it can't be the best thing for someone to be sort of diving back into this in a really deep way. So I tried to let Tom and his guys, in some ways take the lead, not wanting to push too hard in no way that was going to, kind of do damage to them, because, no story is worth in any way being the cause cause of emotional pain or sort of a regression for these guys who have, are trying to find a way of coping with this.
And that kind of leads to another question I want to ask you was, what is and was your repertorial approach to such sensitive issues of, death of a friend, and PTSD?
Well, one thing that was really worked out well with this story, and it's a luxury these days especially, one that you're able to write something at a length that you can really get into a subject and explore it, but also at time. If you say you work on a newspaper, you have an afternoon, or maybe if you're lucky, you get cut loose for a couple days to go a little deeper into a story, unless it's one of those things you're doing on your own time and it's a long-term project that you're dipping into when you can carve out a space and you're, falling over weeks or months. But in this case, going to Afghanistan, when you're with these guys on the ground for a week and a half, 2 weeks, you're with them all the time. And you're there 24 hours a day. You're sleeping with them, you're eating with them, you're going on patrol with them. And so you have this real luxury of not having to flip open the notebook right away and say, hey, what was it like this day? And tell me exactly what happened. I don't think I asked anyone really a question for the first 4 days, other than just asking them things about the area they patrol, the logistics of moving supplies, moving men out there, what their mission was out in the area. And we were, when we're hanging out around the patrol base, out on missions. And I didn't really ask them about Ian or Jimmy for several days because I didn't need to, because I knew I was going to be with them. One of the things that was able to do was show, they were able to see my approach and what I was about before I asked them about this really sensitive topic. I was out on patrols with them, so they could see that, I had come to Afghanistan, really cared about hearing about what their experiences were like over there, that I was out exposing myself to some amount of danger on patrols, so they could see that I wanted to understand what their sort of daily situation was like over there. I wanted to see the foot patrols that went on, like the same kind of foot patrol when Ian Muller and Jimmy Mockenhaupt were killed. So that a couple days later, then when I started asking him about it, I was a little bit of a known quantity, and I've been able to talk to him about my past experiences and just hear about their time in Afghanistan, so it wasn't just about that moment. So I think that made it a little bit easier to talk about some of those sensitive and painful topics, and I could come back to it and revisit it. And with Tom, it was many different conversations. Some were sort of longer, deeper, just really intense conversations. And then other times, he'd mentioned something, you could kind of just leave it at that. If it was another nugget of information, I was able to sort of play it by ear in some situations. And if it didn't feel like, it was the right time to sort of press with a couple follow-up questions to dig deeper into it, I knew there was always a time I could go back to it.
Right, and you
plenty of time.
Right, and you going upwards of 4 days without doing your asking questions or doing a traditional interview. I think it fosters a certain degree of trust that this guy isn't just parachuting in and then leaving us a day later. You're proving to them that you're not a hit and run journalist. You're in this for as long as it's going to take.
Yeah, and one of the other things that it enabled was that they could bring up things without me asking about the guys. So I would sit with Tom in the COC in basically the room the little dirt floor room that he and Jimmy lived in, where the radios are at, and it's a combat operations center. And we'd just be sitting there, and Tom would say, "Oh, that was that picture up on the wall. That's Jimmy from the memorial service." Or, "Yeah, we just used to hang out in here and listen to classical music on his laptop." "Oh, really? What kind of things did you listen to?" And so it's a very conversational sort of interview, that it's not going through, here's all these questions, we're sitting here and both of us are aware that, now is the time that we're going to ask questions and give answers, and it would just sort of unfurl in the course of hanging out. It could be watching a movie on his laptop and some of the downtime during the day, and then he would, talk about a specific moment or a funny thing that had happened or something like that. So then, by the time it comes around when I want to start asking about specific things that haven't been brought up yet, I already have an understanding of the living conditions they have out there, what they do on a daily basis, what their mission has been, how the area has changed over the months that they've been there. I know I've heard some little snippets and details about some of the specifics about what had happened to these guys. And so I'm able to start the conversation at a deeper level of understanding on both of our parts, I guess.
Right, and that's how great does that feel as a reporter, to have that kind of liberty where you don't feel rushed by any time constraints. It's just things are going to unfold at their pace, whatever that pace may be.
Yeah, it makes it really hard to go into situations where you don't have that kind of time.
Right.
I don't even know how I would ever go back. I did daily journalism years ago. I don't even know how I'd go back to that.
Mm-hmm.
Like going out and having to fill the notebook with the bare bones of, everything you absolutely need, then go back and write the story up. And, it would be a good exercise, and certainly in discipline and craft for me. Keeping that speed and, building the speed and just keeping that sort of repertorial sense honed. But no, it's really fantastic to be in a situation that you're also not in a danger of forgetting some really key questions,
Yeah.
And I have a terrible memory, or I'll get caught up in a conversation, and then, you leave somewhere like, oh no, I forgot this really pivotal thing. But out there, I'd sit on my cot and I can look through and review notes and think, oh, tomorrow maybe I'll take the conversation in this direction. It's more like so you're just pushing into and exploring areas instead of ticking questions off a list. And then what I would find is that, after a while, you're filling in the mosaic of, the subject, which is nice because along the way, I'm learning all these things that I didn't even know to be interested in. I didn't even know to ask about. And that just comes from having that luxury of having long, rambling but pointed, but, just kind of free-form conversations, and then he'll mention something that opens up a new path to go down. And a lot of times with really, really rich and, for the story, critical information. So
yeah, and those are the type of
time to explore it, but
right. Those are the type of things that are great, that just come with simply putting in the time. It's that sort of art of discovery in research. There are things that as you just mentioned, that'll come up that you had no idea would ever come up, but it did because you spent the hours on the ground just hanging out. As Gates Lee says, the art of hanging out is kind of what we do. And these things come up that you would have never imagined to ask in the first place, and that's another thing that time affords us.
Absolutely, and it's a balance, right? I mean, there's your time is worth money. I mean, I would love it if I didn't have to think about the money end of this stuff, but that's a reality, especially these days, that you can't spend forever working on this stuff. This story was different for me because I just didn't. I've been trying to get it published for quite a while, and had gotten turned down by several magazines before I had talked with Byliner about it, and they ran with it. But this is a story that I care about everything that I write about, some more than others, but this one in particular. wanted to see it out there. I just wanted to be able to find some venue in which to tell the stories that, these guys had, kind of trusted me with. But you can't spend this long. On everything.
Right.
Especially like newspapers are vastly cut back on the amount of really long stories that they're doing that reporters are spending weeks or months working on, and magazines are shrinking their page counts and figuring out the economics of it can be I've found at least can be tricky.
Right.
But there's always the once in a while stories, which this is something I can do that I have the good fortune to do once a year, once every couple of years, or find a way just in downtime that is something I'm continually going back to and pursuing. Any way I can make that work, it's well worth it for me, because this is where I get the most joy and satisfaction and fulfillment writing.
Right, and over the year and a half that you spent reporting this piece, were you wholly committed to this one, or was it one among other stories you were working on at the current time?
No. I was working on many other things at the time. So originally, when I had gone to Afghanistan, I was there for, even in Afghanistan, there were several other stories that I was doing. I was there for 7 or 8 weeks, and this was a 2-week chunk of my time there. And I had gone to find a story about, young men in battle, what happens when leaders die, how do they get through it. I wasn't able to, I pitched it to several magazines and wasn't able to get any traction on it, which in the end is what made the story work so well. Because if I had come home and written that story for a magazine after getting back from Afghanistan as I had originally intended, it would have been a fine story. It would have been about these guys on the ground, what had happened to them, and how they sort of continued on and finished their tour and went home. But what is so powerful about their experiences, and I think especially for outsiders to read about it, is that's only half the story about what happened to them in Afghanistan. The other half, this is everything they lived through when they came home, and as they tried to process and reconcile being back home, being alive, not being seriously hurt, when these people who were so close to them, emotionally close to them, and physically when they got killed, were so close to them, aren't with them. As they deal with this guilt, it's like really just crushing guilt, and the questions of, why these guys, why not me? That unfolded over months. And during that whole time, I was looking for someone to publish a story. And it wasn't until several months after they had come home that Tom had tried to kill himself. As in, they had come home in late July, and that was around Thanksgiving of that year. And I kept in touch with them, and here and there. So every several weeks or couple months, I'd sort of touch base with them. And then finally, in the early part of that next year, when I knew that I finally found a home for the story, then I went down to Camp Lejeune. I went to visit with Jimmy Malachowski's family in Maryland, met Tom's parents, went down to Parris Island where they had all gone through boot camp to do all this other reporting. So I was able to then be back with, it was the first time I'd seen them since I saw them in Afghanistan. I was able to be back on the ground with them and hear about what their time had been like since they had gotten home. So it wouldn't have been, and I don't want to say the story would have been empty, because there's plenty of fine stories that get written from spending time on the ground, but this is only through not being able to find an outlet for the story that I was able to keep following these guys. So I'd be working on other stuff and then kind of revisit it, and then I'd send out another pitch to someone and had to get rejected. And so I'm just glad that finally found a place that would run it.
Right, yeah, and subsequently it was able to sort of bloom and ripen the way you wanted it to, and then you win an outstanding and very prestigious award. as a result of it not finding the homes that you initially wanted it to. So that's a great great tribute to being able to forcefully have to wait to find a different home for it. So,
right, and it was my first experience in writing something for sort of this new medium. I've written stuff for websites, obviously, and it was not with sometimes the best experience with that, because when you write for magazines, it's a slower, more deliberate process. It gets rigorously fact-checked, and there's more involved editing. But a lot of times you write for websites, it goes up fast, and then it just kind of disappears, and shorter length stuff. But with things like Atavist and Byliner and Kindle singles, it's and I think it remains to be seen whether the business model will work. How journalists can throw that kind of thing into their mix. But in this case, if I had written it as a magazine story, it would have been maybe 8,000 words long, which is really long for a magazine story. And that's a gift these days. If you can work on something that's that long. But in this case, it sounds kind of silly saying it, but it wasn't long enough. I couldn't have done justice to the story as I thought it should be told. But with Byliner, with a Kindle single, it's as long as you want to write it. So, and that's their notion of the stories they try to tell are that, too long for magazines, too short for books. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of books out there that don't need to be books.
Right.
But that's just, the accepted length of a book is, 75,000, 80,000 words, 250 pages. And, I couldn't have written a book about these guys' experience. Magazine, I couldn't have told everything that I wanted in there. As a book, then you spend way too much time talking about their background, or their childhood, and, different experiences in the military, and sort of belaboring, drawing out points. But in this, I was able to have the space to get across everything that I wanted in there, and it ended up being, I don't know, it was like 20,000 words or something. So, yeah, it was I lucked out.
Yeah.
Like that, and finding them to publish it.
Nice. So now, with the subtitle, War, Friendship, and the Battles That Never End, how unprepared do you think the American military was for the after effects of this war specifically, maybe every war, but has on the mind of the soldier coming back home?
It's strange. I feel like it's a lesson that they relearn with every war, every extended conflict. They're certainly learning much more about it. I mean, this past decade, almost now this generation of war has been really fascinating for the medical advancements, which happens in every single war. The Civil War, I think, was ambulances. All these advances that have come from, medical advances that we now take for granted that have come from combat. And I think, plastic surgery in World War I, and prosthetics, and blood transfusions, and then in World War I, the advent of some war psychiatry. But it's a long, slow process that you unfortunately need damaged bodies and damaged minds to make some of these advances. And so now, especially with traumatic brain injury and what was learned about concussive force, on the brain, and find all these different ways to measure this and put people through, different imaging scans that weren't available before. But certainly it had been a long time since you had a really big cohort that had been through these traumatic experiences. And Vietnam vets are still thousands and thousands of Vietnam vets who are struggling with their experiences from that war. And then the problem, of course, is that they come back after the war and have emotional wounds from what they had seen, what done, and then if those don't get addressed and treated and resolved somehow, it leads to other effects, whether it's substance abuse or, a failed relationship, and then those things just build upon each other, so you get to be years later, and, how do you untie that big knotted up ball of twine? What's the cause? What's the effect? Well, the root cause, might be having been to war and what they saw and what it did to them. But then there's always secondary and tertiary effects. So at least now with these guys, Tom Worrell and his buddies, when it's soon after they came home, and the hope is that if they can get help, and they can have someone to talk to and be able to work through some of this stuff with some old methods and with, some new treatments that have come about, as the military learns about the damaging effects of this war, that they can get themselves on a better path before it, compounds with all these other problems in their life. It's Tom that it started to affect his relationship with his wife and with his kids, and fortunately he did not, wasn't successful in trying to kill himself, and fortunately he got to a place where he was comfortable and willing to ask for help, and he was able to save himself, save his relationship with his wife and his kids, and I think a lot of that also in these wars, and just with combat in general, is this stigma of appearing weak and asking for help and that kind of thing. And I think the military has done finally a better job of reducing some of that. Letting guys know that this is just a part of what you go through, and it's okay. It doesn't mean that you're deficient in any way as a leader. It doesn't mean that you're weak or that you can't handle situations that you're put in. It's just part of it. And then you have to, it's exhibiting some real amount of strength to step forward and be like, I need someone to talk to help process some of this stuff. But for Tom also to be willing to talk about that with me is, it's pretty amazing, and it's I think it left me with some amount of feeling like a real responsibility to get the story right, and I'm not saying a responsibility to tell a story that Tom is going to be happy with, or the guys, but to, if they're going to share this with me, then I just felt like a real, as I was writing that, having all that stuff in my notebooks, I felt a real burden to tell as true of a story as I could, because that's the only reason they were talking to me. Like, that they needed some payoff for revisiting these really painful things. And for them, that payoff is that they can know that the story of their friends is being told and what these guys were like, but also that what they've gone through, it's meaningful and it matters, even though it has caused them and their families great pain. It's not, it's not forgotten as soon as they come home.
And how do you think, being a former infantryman yourself, how has that given you authority to pursue these types of stories with these particular characters?
Well, when I got on the ground with the Marines, I think it definitely helped, that initial vetting process. That I had been there as a journalist a couple of times, but had also been in uniform, and so even though my experiences were different from theirs, they were similar enough, especially compared to other civilians that they might know, that I think it took a little bit less time for them to let their guard down a little bit and be ready to engage me in conversation. But I think in general, for any journalist who's there, it goes a long way. Just that journalist cares enough to tell the story to go out there and expose themselves to danger and be on the ground with the guys.
Yeah.
I think that that doesn't pass notice by the guys who are out there. I mean, a lot of them will complain about journalists, and rightly, in some cases, rightly so. I mean, there's all different levels of concern and professionalism practice in those situations, and unfortunately, sometimes people have bad experiences as journalists for legitimate reasons. But I think in general, there's a lot of really wonderful, professional, dedicated people who go to places like Afghanistan to tell these stories. So I think that they definitely appreciate that. But then from having had some similar experiences from being in the military, that definitely helped. Just in trading stories about past experiences or something like that.
At what point did you know you had enough to start drafting The Living and the Dead?
Well, like I said, I knew. I think when I was in Afghanistan, because it clearly could have been a story that wouldn't have worked at all. That if I had been there and the person who had taken over for Jimmy wasn't communicative, or and also wasn't really interested in opening up and kind of going deep into it, or if just some of the the situation on the ground, it might not have lent itself to a really deep, long narrative. But I think as soon as I had heard some of the broad strokes, especially that Ian had been in the same platoon, and that he was the guy right under Tom, and that Jimmy was the guy right above him, and that Tom was a pretty good storyteller and noticed interesting things and was, a curious guy who read books on the Civil War. And I knew right there that I had a good story, that I would be able to tell this story of Tom and tell the story of leaders in battle through Tom. So I think right there within the first couple days, I knew that at least it wasn't going to be a situation that I'd have to then go off and try to find a different group through which to tell the story. But like I said before, the story evolved and changed, and fortunately, Tom was willing to continue to talk to me and to tell me about what had happened to him in November. Kind of he went into this really dark place, and that he was willing to talk to me about that. And that's when I really knew that. I think that's when I really felt that sort of heavy burden that I was talking about telling their story and getting it out there, because these guys go through this, and Tom's willing to tell me that he had tried to kill himself, and that he was, and he would tell me that he was appreciative that I still cared about the story, and I was still taking time to try to tell it and to follow up with him and see what was going on with him. And so, if he's talking about that, then I really need to find a home for the story so that other people can read about it. So I think it was at that point, upon hearing what had happened to Tom, that he was still willing to talk to me about it. That's when I sort of first had the larger concept of what the story would and sort of should be.
Right, and as you started to sit down at the computer, and now you've got sort of the pressure and burden to tell the story and tell it well, what was your approach to the writing of this story?
My approach with this story was pretty similar to how I approach all the stories. I was pretty sloppy writing process. Well, I don't know if you call it sloppy, but I've never been able to just sit down in front of a computer and start writing and working through, this sort of internally crafted, basic structure idea. I spend a lot of time talking through things in my head, and I'll write down in a notebook, just jot down ideas, and I'll fill a whole page with crazy scribblings and arrows that go here and there, and it's almost like a physical manifestation of my thought process, and I just, as I'm pondering and turning things over about how I best might approach it. And then a lot of times I'll put on little pieces of paper, I'll write down key scenes and dialogues and themes. and then I'll literally lay it out on the floor and just go through it and rearrange stuff until I have a workable concept in my head. I find it really hard to give myself sort of freedom and permission to start forward with something, and I wish it wasn't always this way, because I really feel like it sort of hinders me at times. So no, a lot of times it's better just to start writing and get stuff down, and then you can go back and tweak and revisit. But I need to have a clear concept of where I'm starting and how I'm going to accomplish, put on paper what I have in my mind. So then once I have that, and then I'll just start working through it. And I rarely write, from beginning to end. I'll just write chunks here and there. And that's what's, and I think if it was a different kind of writing, that was more, exploring, an idea or argument or something, that it wouldn't lend itself as well to just, one day say, okay, I'm going to write about when Ian got hit. And it's almost like those little chapters, and it's nice because you can just, as long as I'm secure and confident of the overall structure of it, then I can just, knock off pieces.
How are you able to deploy elements of suspense in the narrative? Specifically, there's an example in the first chapter, the last step, with the metal detector, and I think you really deployed suspense well, where you're really on the edge of your seat, turning the pages to see what's going to happen to the platoon. So how were you able to employ those elements to keep the page turning?
Well, I wasn't there for any of that. That was all after the fact. I was able to talk to him and walk on the road where it happened. This was, I was there a month and a half after Ian had gotten killed. And the actual, Tom knew, remembered, and talking to some of the other guys, there were scraps of dialogue that he remembered and other people remembered, and I felt confident he wasn't relaying whole paragraphs of information. So if he tells me that Ian said, hey, Sergeant World, do you want to take the field or the road? I'm pretty confident that that's quite similar to how that conversation might have gone down. I know there's the fallibility of memory and recollection, those kind of things, but for such an important key moment, in his life, it makes sense that he would remember that, and then you can check with other people. And so I was able to incorporate some dialogue in that, but it's not a very long, for how important that moment is, it's not a very long scene. They're walking back, and they walk down, and Ian's out in the front, and he steps on a bomb. In writing that out, it went too quick. And so I was trying to figure out a way to get across some sense of what it's like when you're out there, because it takes a long time to, you're just walking down the road. And especially if someone is using a minesweeper and holding up at points, and it's this moment that's just loaded with tension and what might happen in the next step. But if you're, that's one of the, obviously the problems of, reconstructing things. If you're not out there to really get a sense of everything that's going on, or little conversations, you might not have a lot to work with. So part of it was having been out there and patrolling that area, and then being able to describe what was going on at the time. And then the other thing was, just sort of, I guess, a stylistic, little device to use. And, these minesweepers, you swing it back and forth. You're walking, and it just tick-tock, tick-tock. I think I described it as like a metronome. So I used that at that moment. So he's talking to him, do you want me to take the field of the road? And then being able to describe a little bit of his thought process that they had started putting bombs in the fields too. So he's like, it doesn't even matter. Both could be dangerous, but the guys are tired, so okay, we'll take the road. So he's up there, and then just using the words of tick-tock, and then you can put something in, another description, another sentence about what's happening, or here's, now he's up by this mud wall, tick-tock. That the whole time, trying to convey that idea that the whole time the bomb detector is going, they're on a road that you don't know. Maybe there's no bombs, maybe there are. But that whole time as they're thinking through what's the best way to go, is he out too far ahead, all of that kind of stuff. And so with Matt Westbrook, who is the dog handler, he's catching up to him because Ian was out too far ahead. So now they're going ahead, and Holly's right there behind Ian. Tick-tock, tick-tock. And then finally, he gets onto the bridge and steps on a bomb. Or I think there was still some debate about whether it was command detonated. Could have been pressure bomb, but it was also probably more likely it was a wire from down the wall and around a corner. So someone was just waiting there.
How did you get your start in journalism?
I gone to journalism school, went to Northwestern back in the 90s, graduated in 1996. I gone out and spent 3 years working for the Providence Journal, doing, suburban bureau reporting. So I was covering school committee and town council and the police and writing feature stories. Did that for 3 years, and then I went over and worked in Cambodia, did an English language newspaper for a couple of years in Phnom Penh. And I had done some freelancing in Korea for just a little under a year, and then I had enlisted in the Army. I was in the Army for about 4 years. And then after that, I got back into writing by writing about the military and about the wars. And initially that was mostly what I was writing about. And now it's probably down to about half of what I write about the military and the wars.
All right, and you've written extensively and brilliantly on the military. But how much of a challenge is it for you to break into some other genres of nonfiction, given your expertise and platform with military writing?
Well, I think you nailed it with that question, that especially these days you have to have some sort of demonstrated niche or ability in a specific area that goes beyond what other writers have, just because it's so hard to break into certain magazines, to certain websites, that kind of thing. That's why I was able to. That's why I was able to get into magazines after the Army. I guess the way I look at it is, I might not have been the best reporter or the best infantryman, but when you put those two circles together, where they overlap is a pretty narrow band. And that's what I was able to sell, just to get a chance to do some of that writing. Because at the time, this is back in 2006, media outlets were really still hungry for war stories, and also with, writers who had some sort of personal experience of the military. And so that's how I was able to get my foot in the door. And it's sort of, from there, it was all, one thing leads to another, so I spent a lot of time writing about the military, and now I've spent more time writing about the outdoors and adventure athletes and some of that kind of stuff. And that came about through writing about the military. I went to Afghanistan in 2009 to write a story about mountain warfare for Outside Magazine. And it was sort of a non-obvious story for their readership, but one that, they would find interesting. That here's, they have all these stories about, hiking and mountaineering. Well, here's guys who are doing that in combat. It's about the added challenges of, you're going up the mountain wearing body armor. You're carrying all this weight in a machine gun, and you're having to, stay off the trail because it might be mined. But now you might fall off the side of the mountain because you're on a dangerous rocky edge. And you might get ambushed and be fighting up there. So I'd gone to write that story, and that then enabled me to get into doing more of outdoor stuff. So now I'll write stuff for outside that has nothing to do with the military.
And how much time do you spend generating story ideas and querying editors at various magazines?
Not enough. Not enough. That's something I should need to carve out more time for, much more time for doing, sort of on a weekly basis. Because it's, even though there's several magazines write for or have written for in the past, they go through changes, and their freelance budgets shrink, or their ad space shrinks, or you never know when one might go out of business. Broadening the pool of relationships for available outlets, hugely important and something that you'd spend more time doing.
Yeah.
But especially these days, you look at all the newspapers that are going away, that don't just either cut way back or don't even exist anymore. Seattle Post-Intelligencer, or Recommend News, and like giant cuts at LA Times or San Francisco Chronicle, and these great journalists who are then, if they haven't gone into something completely different as a line of work, they're freelancing. So it's a pretty big pool of people who are out doing this kind of work.
And to what extent are you dealing with rejection and killed stories?
To what extent?
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? I mean, like...
Oh, just, I guess, what's your experience?
My beer.
I'm sorry?
Just crying in my beer.
Yes, they're crying in your beer stein. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I was telling you, earlier, before you started the interview, that I just last night got a rejection from an editor. And, it was a very thoughtful, nice rejection, but it said, page counts are down, and we have this backlog of assigned stuff, and find this really interesting, but unfortunately can't do anything with it. So, what do you do? Mm-hmm. I'll just try to find a different magazine for it. And with some of these stories, there's a limited pool of appropriate magazines, and I realize you can tweak a pitch to tune it to many, many different publications, but if you're depending on the subject matter, there might only be 5 or 6 appropriate outlets. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the merits of the story. Sometimes they've just run, especially, and I found this these days with writing about the military, there's less of an appetite for it as the wars are thankfully winding down. Mm-hmm. But they might have just run a military story.
Right.
Or they might have run something that was very similar, military or not, something similar to it, or at least not, differentiated enough that it merits another, feature story. So, sometimes just nothing you can do about it. Story and byliner, though, that was a long time. I think I got turned down by 5 or 6 magazines.
Wow.
But it gets to a point that it was really frustrating because there was no place else I could go with it. I just did not know of anything else that I could do with it. And I had a friend who had a connection to someone at Byliner, and I wrote to him and said, "Hey, would you mind, could you introduce me to this guy? Because I'm sort of at wit's end on trying to find a home for this story." And it ended up working out. Sadly, if it wasn't for that was sort of the last ditch effort. If it wasn't for that, I'd just be sitting on a notebook, several notebooks full of really wonderful, compelling material. Nothing to do with it.
Right, and then you've also got you're shouldering that burden of Tom wanting to see the story published, and you're at the same time just struggling to find a home for this great story, and he's probably wondering, hey, when's this thing going to run? I can't wait to read it. And meanwhile, you're at the mercy of of editors and magazines that are just saying it's not the right fit.
Right. How awful would I did feel awful when I think he had even sent me a note at one point, or I sent him a note just to check in with him, and he asked what was going on with it, and I said, I'm still looking. Mm-hmm. Because, he had really opened himself up, and was assuming it was at least for something. It wasn't just so that, because you can't, that's on me that, I'm the journalist. I'm the one who's, supposed to find an outlet for it. And, on Tom's part, and rightfully so, the assumption is that if I show up somewhere I'm like, hey, I want to write this story. And he says, okay, well, it's going to be in print sometime.
Yeah.
There is a reason for me to be talking about this horrible loss of experience in my life. And I realize it's just part of how the business works, and sometimes things don't work out. But while that may be the reality that we live with as writers, that doesn't work for him. Yeah, I was pretty thankful that there was a way that I could finally tell the story and not have to tell him, hey, sorry, it just didn't work out because the media landscape's changing and places aren't running long stories, and that's just offensive to him.
I know.
Okay, wow, great, thanks, man.
Yeah.
I spent all this time talking to you and opening up about this stuff, and it was literally for nothing.
Right.
So, yeah, I would have felt awful.
Right. And what would you say is your daily approach to writing and in your style of journalism?
I think it depends based on just a given day of what I'm working on at the moment. Right now, I'm working on a story about the Civil War. It's almost it's just it's a historical narrative. So after this, I'm going to go down to the public library, and I'm going to go up and sit in the genealogy section, which I just discovered recently and is really amazing. I found some of an obscure book that they had read about that they have on their shelves, the memoirs of a Civil War soldier, and so I'm going to go look for little bits and scraps to fill in the narrative, and I have getting near having a first draft done, but I have a couple chunks that one in particular is kind of some heavy lifting of having to, it's not something that it's not a chunk of narrative that writes itself. It is sort of fun just to sit down and, with dialogue and fast-paced action, and I've been avoiding it for a little while. So I need to get a handle around that section. But so I'll just be going down to write a few. Right, I'd say hopefully 1,000 words today, at least 500. Ideally 1,000 words of this story.
Most writers, I like to say that they like to, play writer. They tweet, Facebook, blog, this and that, but don't have any real traction in nonfiction. And you, on the other hand, you're all about the byline. You've got, how to get out there and query and hustle, and you have little social networking presence, which is the other side of this coin. So, what are your feelings towards social networking for the writer versus turning out great content?
Well, I'm all for it, and if it works for people, I don't understand. I've never taken the time to really explore, what it would do for me. Sadly, about a decade and a half late to the game, last fall I just put up a website. I actually have a website with some of my work on it, but I don't blog on it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know what I would say, in tweets. And I'm sure someone could give me a really good argument about why I should be on Twitter and it would increase, people reading the stuff that I do write. But with Twitter and blogging at this point in my life, the things that I have to say, and I've also never been much skilled at opinion-based writing, and sort of a lot of my writing has just been, reporting and observation and letting other people, tell those stories. But even with that, I'm sure there's ways that Twitter could be valuable to me. I just haven't spent much time figuring out what would be worthwhile coming from me in 140 characters. And the other thing is, and I realize it's all part of the larger notion of having your work out there. And I think these days it'll become more and more important, because I'm used to writing for magazines. You don't have to market it. Magazine does that. It's marketed by the name of the magazine. There's already people who understand what Sports Illustrated or Time is, and then they pick it up, and your story's in there. I think everything's becoming so much more driven by freelancers. Like in the case of The Living and the Dead, it's this ebook, and you kind of have to do some sort of self-marketing with that. It's more like just doing sort of author's marketing for a book.
Mm-hmm.
But as you mentioned, I don't do too much of this. About as deep as I get into it is posting new stories when I have them out on my Facebook page.
All right, and why did you choose to pursue an MFA with Goucher College? And what did you get out of that program?
The MFA in nonfiction, Goucher has a really great program because it's all nonfiction. It's not a mixed genre program, so there's not fiction and poetry. There are some people working on memoir and essays. There's also a lot of journalists, but it's like there's a really strong commitment to being fact-based.
Yeah.
And this is a source of many hot arguments within nonfiction circles about memoir, and there are people have very different approaches to how things in the past are interpreted, and if you're writing about your experiences, that makes it nonfiction. Well, other people have very different views of that.
Mm-hmm.
Goucher, I really liked about that they take an approach that is much more in line with how I came into writing, the kind of writing that I do,
mm-hmm.
which is strong reporting-based nonfiction. Even if you are writing about personal experiences, it gave me a community of writers. As a freelance writer, you spend a lot of time alone. The people
mm-hmm.
you write about, you're going off on trips here and there, and then after a story's over, that sort of connection is removed until the next time you're in that city, and maybe you see those people again. But you don't have that sort of newsroom conversation, the water cooler conversation of just talking to the guy who's that's across from you about what he's working on, or you can say, hey man, can you look at this lead and tell me what you think of this?
Mm-hmm.
That real-time in-person interaction is taken out a lot of times for freelancers. This gave me a community of writers to work with, and the mentors are fantastic. And then also a way to work through craft that isn't just in producing my own, feeding myself-based writing. I had already been writing for a while and had the ability to get stuff published, but this helped me fine-tune a lot of things, and it exposed me to writing that I hadn't spent much time with, but then also ways of looking at my own writing.
Well, Brian Mockenhaupt is the author of The Living and the Dead, War, Friendship, and the Battles That Never End. It is published by Byliner. Brian, I want to thank you again for carving out some time out of your day to do this interview. It's been my great pleasure to speak with you this time.
Thanks, Brandon. Enjoyed talking to you.
This concludes my interview with journalist Brian Mockenhaupt. Be sure to tune in to past and future episodes of #CNF by subscribing to the podcast on iTunes. For questions, concerns, or requests to be on the show, please email me at brendan@brendano'mara.com. Thank you.